The rain fell like God's own judgment on the forgotten streets of East Denver, each drop carrying the weight of broken promises and shattered dreams. It was the kind of October night that cut through your soul, where the cold didn't just chill your bones. It reminded you of every warm place you'd lost, every door that had closed in your face, every system that had failed you when you needed it most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. In the narrow alley behind Murphy's Bar, where the city's light couldn't reach and hope came to die, Marcus Rivera pulled his threadbare army jacket tighter around his shoulders. The fabric was more holes than cloth now, but he could still make out his name on the faded patch, still see the outline of the 82nd Airborne insignia that had once meant everything to him. 52 years old, 3 tours in, Afghanistan, and this was what it had come to. A cardboard shelter wedged between 2 rusted dumpsters, a sleeping bag that had seen better decades, and a small military-issued backpack containing the sum total of his earthly possessions. The American dream, reduced to whatever would fit in 30 pounds of canvas and regret. If you believe that honor never dies, that brotherhood runs deeper than blood, and that sometimes salvation comes riding on 2 wheels, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us where you're watching from, because stories like this need to reach every corner of the world. Sometimes, the smallest act of courage can change everything. Sometimes standing up for what's right costs you everything you have and gives you everything you've lost. The neon sign from Murphy's Bar flickered through the rain, casting sickly red shadows across the wet pavement. Murphy's in cursive letters, with the E burnout so it just read Murph's most nights. It was the kind of place where blue-collar workers came to forget their troubles, where conversations happened in hushed tones, and where a man could disappear without anyone asking too many questions. Marcus had chosen this alley for exactly that reason. 8 months of living rough had taught him things they don't put in survival manuals. How to read the rhythm of a neighborhood, which dumpsters got emptied when, where the police patrol routes ran, and more importantly, where they didn't. Murphy's was perfect, close enough to civilization to feel human, far enough from the main drag to stay invisible. Marcus hadn't always been invisible. Once upon a time, he'd been Sergeant Marcus Rivera, 82nd Airborne, the kind of soldier other soldiers looked up to. He'd led men through the valley of the shadow of death in Kandahar province, brought his boys home when other units couldn't, earned medals that now sat in a storage unit he couldn't afford to keep paying for. The nightmares had started during his second tour. IEDs and midnight raids, and the faces of children who'd been caught in crossfire that wasn't supposed to happen. By his 3rd deployment, he was running on caffeine, adrenaline, and the kind of determination that keeps you moving when your soul has already checked out. But he'd done his duty, always did his duty. Coming home should have been the easy part. The VA had promised help, PTSD counseling, job placement assistance, housing vouchers. There were programs, they said, systems in place, help for heroes who'd served their country with honor. What they didn't mention was the paperwork. Mountains of it, written in bureaucratic language designed to confuse and delay, forms that required other forms, offices that sent you to other offices that sent you back to the first office, phone calls that played elevator music for 45 minutes before disconnecting, caseworkers who changed every 3 months, each one requiring you to start over from the beginning. Marcus had tried. God knows he'd tried. He'd sat in those sterile waiting rooms, filled out those endless forms, told his story to a dozen different people who nodded sympathetically and promised to see what they could do. Meanwhile, his savings evaporated like morning mist. The rent on his 1-bedroom apartment came due. Late fees stacked up like cordwood. Utilities got shut off one by one until he was living in the dark, cold, and eventually not living there at all. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday. He'd packed what he could carry, stored what he couldn't bear to lose, and walked out into a world that had moved on without him. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and a letter of commendation from his commanding officer. None of it mattered when you couldn't make rent. That was 8 months ago. 8 months of shelters that kicked you out during the day and soup kitchens that ran out of soup. 8 months of job interviews where they took one look at the gap in his employment history and suddenly remembered they'd already filled the position. 8 months of trying to stay human in a world that treated him like he was already dead. But Marcus Rivera was still a soldier, still carried himself with that straight-backed pride that came from serving something bigger than yourself. Still looked people in the eye when he spoke, still said yes, sir, and no, ma'am, to anyone who'd listen. The system had broken his circumstances, but it hadn't broken him. Not yet. The rain was getting harder now, drumming against the dumpsters like artillery fire in the distance. Marcus pulled out a cigarette, his one vice. Bought with change he'd panhandled outside the grocery store, and cupped his hands around his lighter. The flame illuminated his face for just a moment, showing eyes that had seen too much but still held a flicker of the man he used to be. He'd chosen Murphy's Bar for its predictability. Working-class crowd, mostly construction, workers and truck drivers who minded their own business. They'd close around midnight, the staff would take out the trash, and then the alley would be quiet until morning. Safe. As safe as anything got when you were living on the street. Tonight felt different, though. There was electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the storm. That old soldier's instinct that had kept him alive in Kandahar was tingling at the base of his skull, telling him to pay attention, to stay alert. Something was coming. Around 11:30 p.m., just as Marcus was settling into his cardboard shelter for another night of restless sleep, he heard the distinctive rumble of a motorcycle pulling into Murphy's parking lot. Not one of those crotch rockets the young kids rode, but something with real power. A Harley, by the sound of it. The engine had that deep, throaty growl that spoke of serious machinery and serious money. Through the narrow gap between dumpsters, Marcus could see the parking lot clearly. The bike was a beauty, a black and chrome Harley-Davidson touring bike, the kind that cost more than most people made in a year. Its rider was dismounting slowly, like someone whose bones had been riding for too many hours. He was a big man, maybe 60 years old, with silver hair and a gray beard that had seen decades of weather. He wore a black leather vest with patches and colors that Marcus recognized even from his hiding spot, Hell's Angels. The real deal. The biker stretched his back, rolled his shoulders, and headed toward Murphy's front door. Just another rider stopping for a drink after a long haul. Nothing unusual about that. Murphy's was on a major highway route, and bikers stopped there all the time. Marcus was about to settle back into his shelter when he heard other voices. Young voices. Angry voices. 3 figures emerged from the shadows at the far end of the parking lot, moving with the predatory swagger that Marcus had learned to recognize in war zones. Trouble was coming, and it was coming fast. The leader was a kid maybe 25 years old, wearing expensive sneakers and a leather jacket that was all style and no substance. Marcus had seen his type before, local tough guys who picked on anyone they thought was vulnerable. Behind him followed 2 more, both carrying themselves like they'd done this before. Well, the leader called out, his voice cutting through the rain. Look what we got here. Old man thinks he's some kind of badass with his little motorcycle gang. The biker Marcus could see the name Bull stitched on his vest, stopped and turned slowly. He was a big man, probably 6'2", and built like someone who'd been swinging hammers and throwing punches for most of his life. But he was alone, and there were 3 of them. Evening, boys, Bull said, his voice calm and steady. Beautiful night for a ride? The young leader laughed, but there was no humor in it. Not gonna be beautiful for you, Grandpa. See, we got ourselves a toll road here. You want to park that bike, you gotta pay the toll? Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd seen this before, in back alleys in Kandahar and Helmand province. Predators circling prey, the strong picking on who they thought was weak. It never ended well for anybody. Bull Henderson, because that was his full name, William Bull Henderson, though Marcus didn't know it yet, had been riding with the Hells Angels for 43 years. He'd been in more fights than he could count, had scars that told stories of battles won and lost. He'd faced down rival gangs, corrupt cops, and his own demons. But he was 61 years old now, and his fighting days were mostly behind him. Son, Bull said quietly, you don't want to do this. I'm just here for a beer, and then I'm gone. No trouble for anybody. But the kid wasn't listening. He pulled out a switchblade, and his friends were spreading out to flank the older man. Your wallet, your watch, and the keys to that pretty bike. Make this easy on yourself. Marcus pressed himself closer to the gap between dumpsters, his soldier's mind automatically assessing the situation. 3 attackers, 1 defender. The kid with the knife was the primary threat, but the other 2 were positioning themselves to cut off escape routes. Classic ambush tactics, probably learned from too many action movies and not enough real-world consequences. Bull was trapped. The bike was behind him, the bar's wall to his left, and the 3 thugs forming a semicircle in front of him. Even if he was 20 years younger, the odds weren't good. At his age, against 3 opponents with weapons and position, it was going to be a slaughter. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, that familiar adrenaline surge he'd known in combat zones. His hands were shaking, but not from cold or fear, from something deeper, from the part of him that had never stopped being a soldier, never stopped believing that good men didn't stand by and watch evil happen when they could do something about it. Leave no one behind. The motto echoed in his head like a prayer. Leave no one behind. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to talk himself out of it. He was homeless, hungry, forgotten by the world. He had nothing left to lose, which meant he had nothing left to give. These weren't his people. This wasn't his fight. He'd done his service, paid his dues, and been thrown away like yesterday's newspaper. He owed the world nothing. But Bull Henderson didn't deserve what was about to happen to him. The old biker had been minding his own business, just stopping for a drink after a long ride. He was somebody's father, somebody's grandfather maybe. Somebody who mattered to someone, even if that someone wasn't here to help him now. Marcus opened his eyes and watched the kid with the knife take another step closer to Bull. The blade gleamed in the dim light from the bar's neon sign. In 30 seconds, maybe less, blood was going to spill in that parking lot. An old man was going to get hurt, maybe killed, and 3 punks were going to walk away thinking they were tough. What would Sergeant Rivera do? The question formed itself in his mind without conscious thought. Not Marcus the homeless vet. Not Marcus the forgotten hero. But Sergeant Rivera, 82nd Airborne, the man who'd led soldiers through hell and brought them home. Sergeant Rivera wouldn't hesitate. Sergeant Rivera would move. The memories came flooding back. Kandahar Province, 2019. His squad pinned down by sniper fire. One of his boys wounded and bleeding in an open courtyard. The odds were impossible. 1 sniper, elevated position, clear field of fire. But Marcus had moved anyway, drawing fire while his medic pulled the wounded soldier to safety. He'd taken a bullet in the shoulder for his trouble, earned a Purple Heart and a letter of commendation from his CO. Sometimes you do the right thing not because you can win, but because it's right. His drill sergeant's voice echoed across the years, as clear as if the man was standing right beside him in the rain. Staff Sergeant Torres, toughest son of a bitch in the army, who taught Marcus what it meant to be a soldier. You don't fight because you hate what's in front of you. You fight because you love what's behind you. What was behind him now? A cardboard shelter and a sleeping bag that smelled like despair? A life that had been reduced to begging for change and hoping the rain would stop? No. What was behind him was 43 years of Bull Henderson's life. A man who'd ridden thousands of miles to get to this parking lot, who'd probably survived his own wars and his own struggles, who deserved better than dying in an alley because 3 punks thought they could take what wasn't theirs. Marcus Rivera stood up. The movement sent a sharp pain through his left knee shrapnel from an IED outside Kabul, but he ignored it. He'd ignored worse. His hands found the tactical knife he still carried in his boot, a habit from the service that had served him well on the streets. 7 inches of tempered steel, sharp enough to shave with, balanced for throwing if necessary. He was thin now, 20 pounds lighter than his fighting weight, weakened by months of poor nutrition and irregular sleep. But muscle memory ran deeper than circumstance. His body fell automatically into the combat stance that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of training. Balanced on the balls of his feet, weight-centered, ready to move in any direction. The rain drummed against his shoulders as he stepped out of the shadows. "Hey!" Marcus called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from leading men in combat. Not loud, but commanding. The kind of voice that made people stop and pay attention whether they wanted to or not. All four men in the parking lot turned toward him. The three thugs looked surprised. They hadn't expected an audience. Bull Henderson's eyes went wide when he saw Marcus step into the light. Homeless, obviously. Thin, weathered, clothes hanging loose on his frame. Not exactly the cavalry anyone would pray for. The leader of the thugs, Tommy Breslin, though Marcus didn't know his name, started laughing. It was an ugly sound, full of confidence and cruelty. "Look what crawled out of the dumpster. You lost, homeless boy? This ain't your concern." Marcus walked steadily across the wet pavement, his boots splashing through puddles that reflected the neon light from Murphy's sign. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides, the knife hidden in his palm, but ready. His eyes never left Tommy's face, reading the micro-expressions that would tell him when the attack was coming. "Actually," Marcus said calmly, "I think it is my concern. See, where I come from, 3 grown men don't gang up on one. That's not how real men handle their business." Tommy's laugh died in his throat. Something in Marcus's voice, in the way he moved, was setting off alarm bells. This wasn't some random, homeless guy stumbling into their robbery. This was something else entirely. "You want some too, old man?" Tommy snarled, waving the switchblade in Marcus's direction. "I got enough for everybody." Bull Henderson was watching Marcus with growing recognition. 43 years in a motorcycle club had taught him how to read people, how to spot someone who could handle themselves in a fight. The homeless man wasn't big, wasn't young, wasn't armed with anything visible, but he moved like a predator. Balanced, controlled, completely unafraid of 3 armed opponents. "Son," Bull said quietly to Marcus, "you don't need to do this. These boys aren't your problem." Marcus never took his eyes off Tommy, but he smiled slightly. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Yeah, I do need to do this. See, I took an oath once. To protect people who couldn't protect themselves. To stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." "You, some kind of cop?" Tommy demanded, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. The homeless man wasn't backing down, wasn't showing fear, wasn't doing any of the things victims were supposed to do. "Soldier," Marcus said simply. 3 tours. Afghanistan. 82nd Airborne. And where I served, we had a saying, leave no one behind. That goes for old bikers getting jumped by punks just as much as it does for Marines pinned down by Taliban. The second thug, a heavy-set kid with prison tattoos, had been circling around to Marcus's left. He was carrying a baseball bat, holding it like he knew how to use it. "Tommy, let's just do this already. I'm getting wet." Tommy nodded, his eyes still locked on Marcus. "Your funeral, soldier boy." The attack came from 3 directions at once. Tommy lunged forward with the knife, aiming for Marcus's chest. The kid with the bat swung for his head. The third attacker, who'd been quiet up until now, came at him from the right with bare hands, but plenty of weight behind them. Marcus Rivera had faced Taliban fighters, suicide bombers, and snipers who could put a bullet through a quarter at 800 yards. 3 street punks with more attitude than skill weren't even close to the worst thing he'd encountered. He sidestepped Tommy's knife thrust, grabbed the kid's wrist, and twisted sharply upward. The switchblade clattered to the wet pavement as Tommy screamed and dropped to his knees. A quick knee to the solar plexus left him gasping and defenseless. The bat-wielder's swing was telegraphed from a mile away. Marcus ducked under it, stepped inside the kid's reach, and drove an elbow into his ribs. The crack of breaking bone was audible even over the rain. The bat fell as the kid doubled over, clutching his side and whimpering. The third attacker hesitated just long enough for Marcus to grab the fallen bat. When the punk finally committed to his charge, Marcus was ready. A solid hit to the knee sent him sprawling, and he didn't get back up. 30 seconds. That's how long it took Sergeant Marcus Rivera to neutralize 3 armed attackers and secure the area. He stood over them in the rain, breathing hard but steady, the bat still in his hands in case any of them wanted to try round 2. They didn't. Tommy was still gasping for air. The kid with the broken ribs was crying. The third one was crawling toward the alley, probably looking for a place to throw up or hide or both. Bull Henderson watched it all with growing amazement. He'd seen bar fights and gang wars and prison riots. He'd never seen anything like what he'd just witnessed. The homeless veteran had moved like a machine, efficient and precise, and absolutely deadly. No wasted motion, no unnecessary violence. Just the minimum force required to end the threat. "Holy shit," Bull said quietly. Marcus dropped the bat and walked over to where Tommy was kneeling. The kid was young, maybe 25, with the kind of face that probably looked tough in a mirror, but showed nothing but fear and pain right now. "You listening to me, son?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel. Tommy nodded weakly. "Good. Here's what's going to happen. You and your friends are going to walk away from here. You're going to forget this parking lot exists. You're going to find honest work and stop picking on people who can't fight back. Because if I hear about you doing this again, if I hear about you hurting innocent people, I'm going to come looking for you. And next time, I won't be so gentle. We clear?" "Yes. Yes, sir," Tommy gasped. "Good boy. Now get out of my sight." The 3 thugs limped away into the night, supporting each other and looking back nervously like they expected Marcus to change his mind and come after them. But he just stood there in the rain, watching them go, making sure they were really gone. When the alley was quiet again, Bull Henderson walked over to Marcus and extended his hand. "Name's William Henderson. Friends call me Bull. You just saved my life." Marcus shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that spoke of decades of hard work. "Marcus Rivera, Sergeant, 82nd Airborne. 3 tours, Afghanistan." "What you just did?" Bull shook his head in amazement. "Son, that was some serious skill you showed there. Where'd you learn to fight like that?" Marcus shrugged. "Army taught me the basics. Afghanistan taught me the rest. When people are shooting at you every day for a year, you either learn fast or you don't come home." They stood there for a moment, 2 warriors recognizing each other across the gap of years and circumstance. Bull was looking at Marcus with new eyes now, seeing past the worn clothes and weathered face to the man underneath. "You're living rough," Bull said. It wasn't a question. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "Been better times. When's the last time you had a hot meal?" The question hung in the air between them. Marcus looked down at his boots, worn through at the toes, held together with duct tape and determination. "Been a while." Bull reached into his wallet and pulled out every bill. He had maybe $300 in cash. "Take this. Get yourself a room for the night, some food. You earned it." But Marcus stepped back, shaking his head. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I can't take your money. I didn't help you for a reward. I helped you because it was the right thing to do." That's when Bull Henderson knew he was looking at something rare, something precious. A man who had nothing left but his honor, and who held on to that honor like it was the most valuable thing in the world. Because it was. "What happened?" Bull asked gently, putting his wallet away. "How does a decorated soldier end up living in an alley behind a bar?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain fall in the amber light from Murphy's neon sign. He'd told this story before, to case workers and bureaucrats and people who nodded sympathetically and then forgot about him 5 minutes later. But something about Bull Henderson made him want to tell the truth. The whole truth. "Came back from my 3rd tour 18 months ago," Marcus said, finally. "Had some adjustments to make. PTSD, they called it. Nightmares, flashbacks, the whole package. Nothing I couldn't handle, I thought. I'd been through worse." He paused, collecting his thoughts. VA promised help. Counseling, job placement, housing assistance. They had programs, they said. Support systems. Help for heroes. He laughed bitterly. What they had was paperwork. Mountains of it, forms that needed other forms. Case workers who disappeared every 3 months. Phone numbers that led to more phone numbers that led nowhere. Bull listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail. Meanwhile, Marcus continued. The bills kept coming. Rent, utilities, food. I had some savings from my deployment pay, but that burned through fast. Applied for every job I could find. But nobody wants to hire a guy with an 18-month gap in his employment history and a tendency to hit the deck when trucks backfire. The rain was lessening now, but neither man seemed to notice. Got evicted 8 months ago. Packed what I could carry, put the rest in storage until I couldn't afford that either. Been on the streets since then. Shelters when I can get in, alleys when I can't. Soup kitchens and food banks and whatever work I can pick up day laboring when somebody needs an extra hand. Marcus's voice was matter of fact, without self-pity, but Bull could hear the pain underneath. The bewilderment of a man who'd served his country faithfully and been abandoned by the system he'd trusted to take care of him. 3 bronze stars, Marcus said quietly. Purple Heart, letter of commendation from my CO. You know what those are worth on the street? Nothing. Less than nothing. They're just pieces of metal and paper that remind you of who you used to be before the world forgot about you. Bull's hands clenched into fists. He'd seen this before, too many times. Good men, brave men, used up by the system and thrown away like garbage. It made him sick. It made him angry. You still got family? Bull asked. Marcus shook his head. Parents died while I was overseas. No siblings. Was married once, but deployment stress killed that. She remarried last year, moved to California with her new husband. Can't blame her. I wasn't much of a husband toward the end. Friends? Most of my unit scattered after we got back. Guys dealing with their own problems, you know? Hard to stay in touch when you don't have a permanent address or a working phone. Marcus managed a weak smile. Turns out fair weather friends are pretty common when the weather turns bad. Bull was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd heard. Then he asked the question that had been bothering him since the fight ended. Why'd you do it? Why'd you risk yourself for a stranger? You could have been killed tonight. Those boys had weapons, and you. You had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Marcus looked up at the sky, letting the rain fall on his face. You ever hear of the warrior ethos? Bull shook his head. It's something they teach you in the army. 4 simple rules that are supposed to guide everything you do as a soldier. Marcus's voice took on the cadence of a man reciting something sacred. I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. And I will never leave a fallen comrade. He looked back at Bull. That last one. It doesn't just mean in combat. It means everywhere, all the time. You see someone in trouble, someone who can't defend themselves, you don't walk away. You don't make excuses. You don't calculate the odds. You do what's right, because that's what separates us from the animals. Bull studied Marcus's face in the dim light. Even when the world's given up on you, even when you've got nothing left, especially then, Marcus said firmly. See, they can take away my apartment, my job, my benefits, my dignity. They can ignore my phone calls and lose my paperwork and treat me like I don't exist. But they can't take away who I am. I'm a soldier. I'm a protector. I'm someone who stands up for people who can't stand up for themselves. That's not something that disappears because you're homeless. Bull Henderson had been in the Hells Angels for 43 years. He'd ridden with outlaws and rebels, men who lived by their own code and answered to no authority but their brothers. He thought he knew what loyalty looked like, what honor meant. But listening to Marcus Rivera talk about doing the right thing, even when it cost him everything, that was something else entirely. That was the kind of man Bull's grandfather had told him stories about, the kind who charged machine gun nests at Normandy and held the line at the Chosin Reservoir. The kind who'd become legends because they understood that some things were more important than survival. You know what I think? Bull said finally. Marcus waited. I think the system didn't forget about you, Marcus. I think it threw you away on purpose. Because men like you are dangerous to people who don't want to do the right thing. You make them look bad just by existing. Marcus frowned. I don't understand. You got politicians and bureaucrats and corporate executives who've never risked anything for anybody, Bull explained. Never put themselves on the line, never sacrificed for something bigger than themselves. And then along comes a guy like you, who gave 3 years of his life fighting for his country and would still give his life for a stranger in a parking lot. You make them look like the selfish cowards they are. Bull's voice was getting heated now, passionate. So they bury you in paperwork. They make you wait in lines that go nowhere. They wear you down and hope you'll just disappear. Because your existence is an accusation. Every day you're out here, every night you sleep in an alley, you're proving that they failed, that their system is broken, that they don't take care of the people who take care of them. Marcus had never thought about it that way before. He'd always assumed his situation was just bad luck, bureaucratic incompetence, falling through the cracks of an overburdened system. But what if it was more than that? What if it was intentional? Well, Marcus said after a moment, if that's true, then they're going to be disappointed. Because I'm still here, still standing, still doing what's right. Bull smiled for the first time since the fight ended. Yeah, you are. And that's something special, brother. That's something worth protecting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Bull reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. It was an expensive smartphone, the kind that stayed connected even in the middle of nowhere. He scrolled through his contacts until he found what he was looking for. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked. "Making a phone call." Bull's thumb hovered over the screen. "See, I'm not just any Hell's Angel, Marcus. I'm the road captain for the Colorado chapter. Been riding with these boys for over 4 decades. And in all that time, I've learned one thing. When you find real honor, real courage, real brotherhood, you don't let it slip away." Marcus started to protest, but Bull held up a hand. "You saved my life tonight. More than that, you reminded me what it means to be a warrior. What it means to stand up for what's right even when it costs you everything." Bull's voice was intense, almost reverent. "That's not something you walk away from. That's something you honor." He pressed the call button. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Bull? What the hell are you calling so late for?" "Stone, I need you to listen to me. Something happened tonight. Something important." Bull gave his president a brief rundown of the evening's events, his voice growing more passionate as he described Marcus's actions. On the other end of the line, Stone's questions grew more frequent, more interested. "You're telling me this homeless vet took down 3 armed guys by himself?" Stone's voice was incredulous. "I'm telling you, he moved like nothing I've ever seen. Military training, combat experience, and more heart than any 10 men I know." Bull looked at Marcus, who was listening with growing alarm. "Stone, this is the kind of man we've been looking for. The kind who understands what brotherhood really means. Where is he now?" "Standing right next to me, looking like he wants to disappear into the rain." Bull smiled at Marcus's obvious discomfort. "Stone, I want to bring him to the clubhouse. I want the brothers to meet him." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Stone Mitchell had been president of the Colorado Hells Angels for 15 years. He'd built the chapter into one of the most respected in the country by being careful about who they let in, who they trusted, who they called brother. But Bull Henderson's judgment was legendary. If Bull said someone was worth their attention, that someone was worth their attention. "Bring him in," Stone said finally. "But Bull, you vouch for this man?" "With my life," Bull said without hesitation. He already proved he'd vouch for mine. Bull ended the call and looked at Marcus, who was shaking his head. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," Marcus said, "but I'm not club material. I'm not even people material anymore. I'm just a broken-down soldier who's lost everything that ever mattered to him." "No," Bull said firmly. "You're a warrior who's been fighting alone for too long. You think brotherhood is about what you own, what you ride, where you live? It's not. It's about who you are when everything else is stripped away. It's about what you do when nobody's watching, when there's nothing in it for you, when helping someone else costs you everything you have." Marcus was quiet, but Bull could see he was listening. "Tonight you had nothing," Bull continued. "Nothing but the clothes on your back and the honor in your heart. And when you saw someone in trouble, you didn't hesitate. You didn't calculate the odds. You didn't worry about what it might cost you. You just did what was right. Bull stepped closer, his voice intense and sincere. That's not weakness, Marcus. That's not failure. That's the purest form of strength I've ever seen. And it's exactly what the Brotherhood is supposed to be about. The rain was stopping now, but neither man moved toward shelter. I don't know anything about motorcycles, Marcus said weakly. Bull laughed. Brother, we can teach you to ride. We can teach you about engines and leather and the rules of the road. But we can't teach you courage. We can't teach you honor. We can't teach you to risk your life for a stranger because it's the right thing to do. You already know all the important stuff. Marcus looked down at his torn boots, his threadbare jacket, his empty hands. I don't even have a bike. Yet, Bull said. You don't have a bike yet. But that's just a detail. A technicality. The man makes the Brotherhood, Marcus. Not the bike, not the leather, not the patches. The man. Bull pulled out his business card. He owned a custom motorcycle shop in addition to his club duties and pressed it into Marcus's hand. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Come by the shop. Meet some of the brothers. See what we're about. No pressure. No commitments. Just come see what family looks like when it's built on choice instead of blood. Marcus stared at the card, his hands trembling slightly. Not from cold this time, but from something else. Something that felt almost like hope. Why? He asked quietly. Why do you care what happens to me? Bull was quiet for a moment, remembering his own story, his own dark times, his own moments when the world had seemed determined to grind him into dust. Because 30 years ago, I was where you are now, Bull said finally. Different circumstances, same desperation. I'd lost everything that mattered to me, my wife, my kids, my job, my self-respect. I was living in my car, drinking myself to death, waiting for the courage to finish the job. Marcus looked up, surprised by the admission. And then I met a Hell's Angel named Tommy the Bear Kowalski. He saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Gave me a chance when nobody else would. Taught me that sometimes family is something you choose, not something you're born into. Bull's voice grew thick with emotion. Tommy died 5 years ago. Cancer. But before he passed, he made me promise something. He made me promise that if I ever met someone like I used to be, someone good who'd been broken by a world that didn't appreciate good, I'd do for them what he did for me. Bull extended his hand again. So, this isn't charity, Marcus. This isn't pity. This is me keeping a promise to a dead friend who saved my life by giving me a reason to live. Marcus looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and shook it. 10 o'clock, Bull said with a smile. 10 o'clock, Marcus repeated. After Bull rode away into the night, his Harley's rumble fading into the distance, Marcus stood alone in the parking lot for a long time. The rain had stopped completely now, and stars were beginning to peek through the breaking clouds. He looked down at the business card in his hand, reading the address by the light of Murphy's neon sign. Henderson Custom Cycles. Quality bikes for quality people. Quality people. When was the last time anyone had called him that? Marcus walked slowly back to his cardboard shelter, his mind reeling from everything that had happened. 3 hours ago, he'd been just another, invisible homeless veteran, forgotten by the world and forgotten by himself. Now he had an invitation to, what? Join a motorcycle club? Become part of something bigger than his own struggles? It seemed impossible. Too good to be true. The kind of thing that happened in movies, not in real life. Real life was bureaucrats who lost your paperwork and case workers who forgot your name and employers who wouldn't give you a chance. Real life was sleeping in alleys and eating from soup kitchens and watching the world move on without you. But as he settled into his sleeping bag, Marcus couldn't shake the memory of Bull Henderson's eyes. There had been something there, something genuine and honest and real. Not pity, not charity, but recognition. One warrior acknowledging another. The man makes the brotherhood, not the bike. Marcus pulled out his wallet, a worn leather thing that held his military ID, his Purple Heart citation, and $17 in cash and carefully tucked Bull's business card inside. Then he lay back and stared up at the stars, thinking about promises and second chances and the kind of family you choose instead of inherit. Sleep didn't come easily. His mind kept replaying the fight, analyzing his actions, wondering if he could have handled it differently. But more than that, he kept thinking about what Bull had said about the system, deliberately throwing people like him away, about being dangerous to people who didn't want to do the right thing. What if Bull was right? What if Marcus's homelessness wasn't just bad luck or bureaucratic incompetence, but something more systematic? What if there were forces at work that actively wanted men like him to disappear, to give up, to stop being living reminders of what courage and honor looked like? The thought should have made him angry. Instead, it made him more determined. If they wanted him to disappear, then staying visible was an act of rebellion. If they wanted him to give up his principles, then holding on to them was a form of resistance. Marcus Rivera might not have a home, might not have a job, might not have anything the world considered valuable. But he still had his integrity. He still had his code. He still had the part of himself that would risk everything to protect a stranger. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Marcus woke before dawn, as he had every morning for the past 8 months. Old habits from the military died hard, and reveille was printed on his soul. He folded his sleeping bag with military precision, broke down his cardboard shelter, and packed everything into his backpack. Leave no trace, take only memories, another lesson from a life of service. He used the restroom at a gas station, 2 blocks away, cleaned up as best he could with paper towels and cold water, and bought a cup of coffee with quarters he'd saved from panhandling. The clerk looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and disgust that Marcus had grown accustomed to, but he nodded politely and went about his business. By 9 o'clock, he was standing outside Henderson Custom Cycles, looking at the building that might change his life. It was bigger than he'd expected, a converted warehouse with bay doors and the sound of power tools coming from inside. The parking lot was full of motorcycles, Harleys, mostly, but some custom jobs that looked like they'd cost more than Marcus had made in his last year of military service. Men in leather jackets moved between the bikes, talking in low voices, drinking coffee from paper cups. Hell's Angels. The real deal, not the Hollywood version or the media stereotype, but working men who'd chosen to live by their own code. They looked up when Marcus approached, their eyes measuring him, evaluating him, trying to figure out what this homeless stranger was doing on their turf. Marcus felt every instinct he'd developed over 8 months of street living telling him to run. These weren't social workers or case managers or bureaucrats who would nod sympathetically and forget about him. These were hard men who'd lived hard lives, and they didn't look like they suffered fools gladly. But he'd given his word to Bull Henderson. In the military, your word was everything. You might lose your money, your possessions, your life, but you never broke your word. Not if you wanted to call yourself a soldier. At exactly 10 o'clock, Bull Henderson emerged from the shop. He was wearing work clothes now instead of riding leathers, but he still carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never backed down from anything. When he saw Marcus, his face broke into a genuine smile. "You came?" Bull said, walking over with his hand extended. "Said I would," Marcus replied, shaking the offered hand. "Good man. Come on, let me introduce you to some of the brothers." The first person Bull introduced was Stone Mitchell, the chapter president. Stone was a mountain of a man, 6'4", and built like he could bench press a small car. His beard was iron gray, his eyes were pale blue, and his handshake felt like it could crush rocks. But when he looked at Marcus, there was no hostility in his gaze. Just curiosity and the kind of careful evaluation that leaders used when sizing up potential allies. "So you're the man who saved Bull's ass last night," Stone said without preamble. "I'm the man who helped out when someone needed help," Marcus replied carefully. Stone studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. "Good answer. Humble. I like that." He turned to the group of bikers who'd gathered around. "Brothers, this is Marcus Rivera, Sergeant, 82nd Airborne, 3 tours in Afghanistan. Bull tells me he moves like lightning and hits like thunder." One by one, The Hells Angels stepped forward to shake Marcus's hand. There was Diesel, the sergeant-at-arms, a compact man with prison tattoos and eyes that had seen too much. There was Prophet, the club's chaplain, who looked more like a philosophy professor than a biker until you noticed the scars on his knuckles. There was Road Dog, Hammer, Wrench, and a dozen others, each with their own story, their own reasons for choosing this life. What struck Marcus was how they treated him. Not with pity or charity, but with the kind of reserved respect that warriors showed each other. They'd heard what he'd done the night before, and in their world, action spoke louder than circumstances. "Bull says you don't have a bike," said Wrench, the club's chief mechanic. He was a thin man with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails and the kind of encyclopedic knowledge of engines that came from decades of hands-on experience. "Never owned one," Marcus admitted. "Always wanted to learn, but circumstances never allowed it." Wrench nodded thoughtfully. "Well, circumstances change. You want to see what we're working on?" Marcus spent the next hour getting a guided tour of the shop. It was impressive state-of-the-art equipment, custom parts worth more than most people's cars, and the kind of craftsmanship that turned motorcycles into works of art. But more than the machinery, Marcus was struck by the camaraderie. These men worked together like a well-oiled machine, finishing each other's sentences, anticipating each other's needs, moving with the kind of coordination that came from years of trust and shared experience. It reminded him of his squad in Afghanistan. The easy banter, the casual competence, the unspoken understanding that everyone had everyone else's back. It was something he'd missed more than he'd realized. "You ever think about what you want to do with your life?" Stone asked during a break in the tour. Marcus considered the question. "Used to want a lot of things. House, family, career, the whole American dream package. These days, I mostly just think about getting through the day." "That's survival," Stone said. "I'm talking about living. There's a difference." Marcus didn't have an answer for that. For 8 months, survival had been enough. Food, shelter, safety, the basic necessities had consumed all his energy and attention. The idea of having goals beyond that, of planning for a future beyond the next meal, seemed almost foreign. "I used to be a good soldier," Marcus said finally. "Maybe I could be that again, in some form, help people, make a difference. But honestly, I'm not sure I remember how to hope for things anymore." Stone nodded understanding. "Hope's like a muscle. You don't use it, it atrophies. But it can be rebuilt." Around noon, the brothers gathered in the shop's break room for lunch. Someone had ordered pizza, and there was plenty for everyone, including Marcus. As they ate, conversation flowed around the table club business, family news, plans for upcoming rides. Marcus mostly listened, but occasionally someone would ask his opinion or include him in the discussion. It felt good, better than good. For the first time in 8 months, Marcus felt like he belonged somewhere, like he was part of something larger than his own struggles. "Tell us about Afghanistan," Prophet said during a lull in the conversation. "What was it like over there?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. Most people asked that question out of curiosity or politeness, not really wanting to hear the answer. But these men were different. They'd lived through their own battles, faced their own demons. They'd understand. "Hot," Marcus said finally, getting a few chuckles. "Dusty, dangerous, beautiful, in its own way. The people, most of them just wanted to live their lives, raise their kids, make an honest living. But there were others who'd kill you for the crime of being American, or for helping Americans, or for being in the wrong place at the wrong time." He paused, remembering. "My job was to keep my squad alive and complete the mission. Sometimes those two things conflicted with each other. Sometimes you had to choose between doing the right thing and doing the safe thing." "Which did you choose?" Diesel asked. "The right thing. Every time. That's what we were there for, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, to stand up for what's right even when it was hard, even when it cost us." Stone leaned forward. "That attitude cost you, didn't it? After you came back?" Marcus nodded. "The Army teaches you to be a certain kind of person. Honest, loyal, self-sacrificing, dedicated to something bigger than yourself. But when you get back to the civilian world, those qualities can be inconvenient. Employers want team players who won't rock the boat. The government wants veterans who will quietly take whatever benefits they're offered and not ask too many questions. And you weren't willing to do that, Stone observed. Couldn't do that, Marcus corrected. That's not who I am. I'd rather sleep in an alley than compromise my principles. The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of that statement settling over the group. Then Bull spoke up. That's exactly why you belong here, brother. Because you understand what it means to stand for something, even when it costs you everything. After lunch, Stone asked Marcus to take a walk with him. They strolled around the shop's property, past the parking lot full of gleaming motorcycles, toward a small office building attached to the main warehouse. You know much about the Hells Angels? Stone asked as they walked. Only what most people know. Motorcycle club. Been around since the 40s, got a reputation for being tough guys. Stone smiled. That's about what I expected. The media likes to paint us as criminals, outlaws, dangerous rebels. Some of that's true. We don't apologize for living by our own rules, and we don't back down from fights we didn't start. But there's a lot more to it than that. They stopped outside the office building, and Stone pointed to a plaque mounted next to the door. It was a list of names under the heading, Brothers Who Served. 60% of our membership are military veterans, Stone said. We got guys who served in Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan. Men who came back from war and found it hard to fit into a world that didn't understand what they'd been through. Marcus studied the names on the plaque, recognizing some of the units, some of the decorations listed after the names. The club gives us something the outside world doesn't, Stone continued. Brotherhood, purpose, a place where your word means something, where loyalty isn't just a concept, where standing up for what's right is more important than following rules that don't make sense. They went inside the office, where Stone poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. I'm going to tell you something, Marcus, and I want you to listen carefully. Last night, when you stepped out of those shadows and faced down 3 armed men to protect someone you'd never met, you proved something. Not just to Bull, not just to us, but to yourself. Stone sat down behind his desk, gesturing for Marcus to take the chair across from him. You proved that being homeless doesn't make you worthless. Being forgotten by the system doesn't make you broken. Having nothing doesn't mean you are nothing. Marcus felt something tight in his chest beginning to loosen. What it proved, Stone continued, is that you're exactly the kind of man this brotherhood was built for. A warrior who's been fighting alone for too long. A protector who's been protecting everyone except himself. A man who understands that honor isn't about what you own, it's about what you do when nobody's watching. Stone leaned forward, his expression intense. I'm not going to offer you charity, Marcus. I'm not going to offer you pity. What I'm going to offer you is opportunity. The chance to be part of something bigger than yourself again. The chance to use your skills, your experience, your warrior's heart for something that matters. What kind of opportunity? Marcus asked carefully. We run several legitimate businesses, this custom shop, a construction company, and a security firm. All of them could use someone with your background, your integrity, your leadership experience. But more than that, we take care of our community. Food drives, toy runs for underprivileged kids, protection for people who need it. We're not just a motorcycle club, Marcus. We're a brotherhood that stands up for those who can't stand up for themselves. Marcus felt that familiar tightness in his throat, the one that came when someone offered him kindness he wasn't sure he deserved. Why? He asked quietly. Why would you do this for me? Stone was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. 23 years ago, I was where you are now. Different circumstances, same desperation. I'd lost everything, my business, my marriage, my kids, my self-respect. I was living in my truck, drinking myself to death, planning to eat a bullet rather than face another day of failure. Marcus leaned forward, recognizing the tone of a man sharing something sacred. And then I met the Hells Angels. They saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, gave me a chance when nobody else would. taught me that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born into. Stone's voice grew thick with emotion. They saved my life, Marcus. Not just my physical life, but my soul. They gave me purpose again, brothers again, a reason to wake up in the morning again. And part of that salvation comes with a responsibility to do for others what was done for me. Stone stood up and extended his hand. So, I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you brotherhood. I'm offering you the chance to be part of something that matters, something that stands for honor and loyalty and protecting those who need protection. Marcus looked at the offered hand, then up at Stone's face. He saw no pity there, no condescension, no false promises, just recognition. One warrior acknowledging another. What would I have to do? Marcus asked. Be yourself, Stone said simply. Be the man who stepped out of the shadows last night. Be the soldier who never left anyone behind. Be the protector who'd rather sleep in an alley than compromise his principles. Marcus stood up slowly and shook Stone's hand. When do I start? The next 6 hours changed Marcus Rivera's life in ways he couldn't have imagined when he woke up in a cardboard shelter that morning. First came the practical matters. Stone drove him to a local bank where the Hells Angels had connections, helped him open an account, and deposited enough money to cover immediate expenses. Then to a thrift store where they picked out clean clothes that actually fit work clothes, casual clothes, and one good outfit for special occasions. Every man needs clothes that make him feel human, Stone explained as Marcus tried on a leather jacket. It's not vanity, it's dignity. Next was a barbershop, where an old-timer named Giuseppe gave Marcus his first professional haircut in over a year. As the gray hair fell away, Marcus caught glimpses of himself in the mirror, not the broken homeless veteran, but the soldier he used to be. The man he'd never stopped being underneath the accumulated despair. You clean up good, Giuseppe said with a smile. You got honest eyes, I can always tell. But the most important stop was Henderson Custom Cycles, where Bull and Wrench were waiting with something special. Every brother needs a bike, Bull said, leading Marcus to a covered motorcycle in the corner of the shop. Can't be a Hell's Angel without proper transportation. When they pulled off the tarp, Marcus felt his breath catch. It was a Harley-Davidson Sportster, not new, but beautifully maintained, painted in classic black with chrome that gleamed like silver. It was the kind of bike that looked fast even when it was standing still. She's a 2018 Iron 883, Wrench explained, running his hand along the fuel tank. Previous owner was a brother who passed last year. His family wanted her to go to someone who'd appreciate what she represents. Marcus walked around the bike slowly, taking in every detail. He'd never owned anything this beautiful, this powerful, this symbolic of freedom and rebellion and brotherhood. I can't afford this, he said quietly. You already paid for it, Bull said. Last night, in that parking lot, sometimes payment comes before purchase. Stone stepped forward with a set of keys and a small leather folder. The title's already transferred. Registration's current. Insurance is handled. All you need now is to learn to ride her. Marcus took the keys with trembling hands. They were warm, solid, real. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Stone replied. Just promise us you'll use her for the right reasons. To help people who need help. To stand up for what's right. To be the kind of brother this club was built to honor. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. The riding lessons started immediately. Bull and Wrench took turns teaching him the basics: clutch, throttle, brakes, balance. Marcus had excellent coordination from his military training, and he was a fast learner. Within an hour, he was making slow circuits around the shop's parking lot. Within 2 hours, he was ready for the street. Natural talent, Wrench observed, like he was born for this. As the sun began to set, Stone gathered the brothers in the shop's main bay for what he called a talking circle. It was an informal ceremony, but Marcus could sense the weight of tradition behind it. Brothers, Stone began, his voice carrying the authority of years of leadership. Today we welcomed a new man into our midst, a warrior who's proven his worth not with words but with actions. A protector who understands that true strength comes from standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. The Hell's Angels formed a loose circle around Marcus, their faces serious but welcoming. This wasn't initiation that would come later, if Marcus chose to pursue full membership, but it was recognition, acceptance, the beginning of brotherhood. Marcus Rivera. Stone continued, "You came to us as a stranger, a man the world had forgotten. But we see you as you truly are, a brother who was fighting alone for too long, a warrior who never stopped being a warrior, even when everything else was taken away." Bull stepped forward with a leather vest, black and unadorned except for a small patch that read, "Prospect." It wasn't full colors, those had to be earned over time, but it was a start, a symbol that he belonged somewhere again. "This is just the beginning," Bull said as he helped Marcus into the vest. "If you choose to walk this path, if you choose to be our brother, there will be challenges ahead. Tests, trials, opportunities to prove yourself. But you won't face them alone. Never alone." Marcus looked around the circle at the faces of men who'd welcomed him without judgment, who'd seen his potential instead of his circumstances, who'd given him hope when he'd forgotten what hope looked like. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank us by being yourself," Stone replied. "Thank us by never forgetting where you came from or who you're fighting for. Thank us by being the kind of brother who makes this club stronger just by being part of it." Prophet, the club chaplain, stepped forward with a small silver medallion on a chain. "This is St. Michael," he explained, placing it around Marcus's neck. "Patron saint of warriors, protector of those who protect others. Wear it as a reminder that you're never fighting alone." As the ceremony concluded and the brothers began to disperse, Bull pulled Marcus aside. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" Bull asked. Marcus had been dreading this question. In all the excitement of the day, he'd temporarily forgotten that he was still homeless, still had nowhere to go when the sun went down. "I'll figure something out," Marcus said quietly. Bull shook his head. "Brother, you're not sleeping in any alley tonight, or any night from now on. You're coming home with me." Bull Henderson lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Denver, the kind of place that spoke of comfort without ostentation. A well-maintained lawn, a two-car garage converted into a workshop, and a front porch with chairs that looked like they got regular use. It was the home of a man who'd worked hard for what he had and appreciated every inch of it. "Nothing fancy," Bull said as they pulled into the driveway, Bull on his touring bike, Marcus following nervously on his new Sportster. "But it's warm, it's clean, and there's always food in the refrigerator." Inside, the house was exactly what Marcus had expected. Comfortable furniture that had seen better days but was well cared for. Family photos on the mantelpiece showing Bull with various groups of people, some in Hell's Angels colors, others in civilian clothes. A big screen TV, a bookshelf full of motorcycle magazines and military history, and the lingering smell of coffee and leather. "Guest rooms down the hall," Bull said, leading Marcus through the house. "Bathrooms right next door. Towels in the closet. Soap in the shower. Make yourself at home." The guest room was simple but clean. A double bed with fresh sheets, a dresser, a window that looked out onto the backyard. To Marcus, who'd been sleeping on cardboard for 8 months, it looked like luxury. "Bull," Marcus said, standing in the doorway, "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this." Bull turned, his expression serious. "You already did, last night, when you stepped out of those shadows. But if you want to keep repaying, then be the man you showed me you are. Be the brother this club needs. Be the warrior who never stopped, fighting for what's right." That night, Marcus lay in a real bed for the first time in 8 months, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. 24 hours ago, he'd been just another invisible homeless veteran, forgotten by the world and forgotten by himself. Now he had a roof over his head, clothes that fit, a motorcycle of his own, and the beginning of something he'd thought was lost forever, a family. He thought about his squad in Afghanistan, about the bonds forged in combat and the promise they'd made to each other. Leave no one behind. He kept that promise overseas, bringing his boys home when other units couldn't. But somehow, he'd left himself behind. Lost himself in the bureaucratic maze of coming home, forgotten himself in the daily struggle for survival. The Hells Angels had found him again, not the homeless veteran, not the broken man sleeping in alleys, but the warrior he'd never stopped being. They'd seen through the circumstances to the character underneath, recognized the honor that no amount of hardship could diminish. Marcus fingered the St. Michael medallion around his neck, feeling its weight, its warmth, its promise that he was never fighting alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the trust they'd placed in him. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was home. Sleep came easier than it had in months, untroubled by nightmares or the constant vigilance of street living. In his dreams, he was riding down an endless highway, the rumble of his Harley mixing with the sound of other engines, other brothers, all heading toward a horizon that promised hope instead of despair. The last thing he remembered before drifting off was the sound of rain beginning to fall again outside his window. But this time, the rain didn't matter. This time, he was warm and dry and safe. This time, he wasn't alone. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the Denver skyline gold when Marcus Rivera pulled his Harley into the parking lot of the Veterans Administration building. He was dressed in clean work clothes, the Hells Angels prospect vest worn with pride over a button-down shirt. The St. Michael medallion caught the light as he dismounted, a reminder of the brotherhood that had saved his life. But he wasn't here alone. Behind him, the rumble of dozens of motorcycles announced the arrival of the Colorado Hells Angels chapter, along with members from 3 neighboring states. Over 100 bikes, over 100 brothers, all here for one purpose: to make sure no veteran was left behind. Marcus had become something of a legend in the 3 months since that rainy night behind Murphy's bar. His story had spread through the brotherhood, then beyond it, reaching veterans organizations and advocacy groups across the country. The homeless vet who'd risked everything to save a stranger, who'd been rewarded with brotherhood and purpose, who'd used his second chance to help others find their own. Stone Mitchell dismounted his bike and walked over to where Marcus was checking his notes one final time. "You ready for this, brother?" Stone asked. Marcus looked up at the VA building, remembering the countless hours he'd spent in its waiting rooms, the endless forms he'd filled out, the promises that had never been kept. But today was different. Today, he wasn't here as a supplicant begging for help. Today, he was here as an advocate, backed by the power of brotherhood and the promise that no one would be forgotten. "I'm ready," Marcus said. The plan was simple but effective. Marcus had spent weeks identifying veterans who'd fallen through the cracks, men and women, like himself, who'd been buried in bureaucracy, lost in the system, forgotten by the very institutions that were supposed to help them. Today, with the Hells Angels providing backup and media attention, those cases would be resolved. The sight of over 100 bikers walking into the VA building got everyone's attention. Suddenly, caseworkers who'd been unavailable for months were eager to meet. Supervisors who'd never returned phone calls were ready to discuss solutions. Directors who'd hidden behind policy and procedure found themselves face to face with men and women who wouldn't be ignored. Marcus handled each case personally, his military bearing and insider knowledge of the system cutting through red tape like a sword through silk. Housing vouchers that had been lost were suddenly found. Disability claims that had been under review for years were suddenly approved. Medical appointments that had been unavailable suddenly opened up. By the end of the day, 17 veterans had received the help they'd been promised and denied. 17 men and women who'd been forgotten by the system were now getting the support they'd earned through their service. As the Hells Angels prepared to leave, gathering in the parking lot for one final group photo, Marcus found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him here. 8 months ago, he'd been sleeping in an alley, convinced that his life was over, that he was worthless, that the world had moved on without him. One act of courage, stepping out of the shadows to help a stranger, had changed everything. Not because it had earned him rewards, but because it had reminded him of who he was underneath the circumstances. A warrior, a protector, a man who stood up for what was right no matter the cost. Bull Henderson walked over, his face beaming with pride. "How does it feel, brother?" Marcus looked around at the brotherhood that surrounded him, at the veterans they'd helped, at the promise of more good work to come. "It feels like coming home," he said. Bull clapped him on the shoulder. "That's because you are home. This is what brotherhood looks like, not just taking care of each other, but taking care of those who can't take care of themselves." As the sun set over Denver, the Hells Angels mounted their bikes and rode into the twilight, their engines thundering like a promise that echoed across the city. Justice, honor, brotherhood. The kind of values that never went out of style, that never lost their meaning, that never failed to transform lives when they were lived with conviction. Marcus Rivera rode at the front of the pack, his prospect vest flying in the wind, the St. Michael medallion warm against his chest. Behind him rode 100 brothers who'd proven that family was something you chose, not something you were born into. Around him stretched the open road, full of possibilities and purpose, and the promise of more good work to come. He was no longer the homeless veteran sleeping in an alley behind Murphy's Bar. He was no longer the forgotten hero discarded by an ungrateful system. He was Marcus Rivera, Hell's Angel prospect, advocate for the forgotten, warrior for the worthy. He was home. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.